Good evening and welcome. It is Monday night. It is 7 p.m. If you're in the room or logging in online, then you're here for our special expert series here where we have speakers come every Monday night as part of the CARES program. If it's your first time here, the CARES program is Caregivers and Relatives Empowered for Support. And what type of support? It's in support of family members, those who are supporting those with substance misuse and recovery. And so every week, what we have here is something special, an event where we bring in experts that share their knowledge and make themselves available for questions and answers. So that is what's happening tonight. Our focus tonight is speaking with Dr. Clemons, Dr. David Clemons, who is a psychologist here out of Austin, who has extensive experience working with families and couples, and has also been an educator and has worked really well in the space of recovery. So I won't steal anything from what he's saying here, but what you will see is me taking lots of notes like everyone else. And towards the end, we're going to open up space. So please, as you have questions, write them down because we will have microphones going around. And for those online watching us, just know that we're also taking notes and feel free to filter any questions that you have through social media and we'll be able to answer that. And a quick disclaimer here, it is a live streaming event. So speakers and audiences, we're just encouraging everyone that if you do have someone that is part of your story, we ask that you reference to them as loved ones so that we can protect their confidentiality. And of course, the streaming is only here at the stage, so everyone in the audience, we maintain that anonymity. Please help me out. Anonymity. Okay, so there you go. This is my first assistance from our doctor, so thank you.
You're lucky I knew that.
The title for tonight is Addiction and Trauma, the Traumatic Impact of Addiction and Post-Traumatic Growth. And with that, we hand the microphone over.
Thank you, Renee. Welcome. Thank you for coming, and thank you for asking me to be here. I really appreciate the opportunity. This is a topic that is near and dear to my heart. I am a psychologist here in Austin, so I certainly work with and treat addiction and primarily specialize in working with people who grew up with addiction, who dealt with it in a parent, a caregiver, but I've also worked with people who are dealing with it in a spouse or a child, all different kind of iterations. It's certainly a specialty area of mine. And I also identify personally with this topic because I grew up in a household with alcoholism. Both my parents were impacted with it. And that certainly had a traumatic impact on me and my life. And I would also later, develop the disease myself. And I'm happy to say I've got 37, almost 38 years of recovery from addiction. Thank you. And that's a really significant part of my life. And I have another family member, a child of mine who developed addiction about 6 years ago almost now, who's happily in recovery for these last almost 6 years. So as a friend of mine said, David, you can talk about this from very different angles, multiple angles. And yes, I can. I can talk about it from the experience of a family member. I can talk about his experience as a father, but also as a professional treating it and working with it. So everything that I talk about tonight that I will speak to about this applies to me as well. I identify with having PTSD and being in recovery from that as well, and the particulars of that from having addiction in my family. So to start, I want to begin by acknowledging the courage that it takes to face dealing with addiction in a family member or loved one, and just acknowledge it's a real struggle and it's not an easy journey. So I appreciate anybody that has the courage to face it, to be here, to take any kind of step you can to get informed and to begin the process of recovery. It seems essential to me that we all recognize that the impact of addiction goes beyond the individual struggling with it, right? It affects the entire family, causing trauma, stress, and emotional pain. I think we all know that. And before I go much further, one of the things I want to say is one of the models I have or the rule sets I have in my head as a psychologist is one of the things I consider is that if I'm doing my job well, I'm talking to people about things that deep down inside they already know. I'm telling you things you already know. And I sit here tonight in all humility telling you, you already know these things. And really my role is just to remind you of some things or to put some things in ways that maybe you haven't thought about as clearly or as often. And I'd like to do this together. I will at times ask you for your input, for examples of some of these things that we're going to talk about. I'll provide some of my own. I'll try to stick to the rules about not identifying people. We'll see if I can do that. Throughout the talk, we're going to explore kind of three objectives tonight. The first one is, what is PTSD? And first of all, how many of you are familiar with PTSD as a diagnosis? Know what it is, have read some things about it, okay? How many of you know quite a lot about it? Okay. And how many of you would you consider it to be kind of new, something you're not as familiar with? You raise your hand if that's something, if it's kind of a new thing to you, okay? Nobody's really raising their hand on that. All right, that'll help me kind of move through this section, but that's where I want to start, and then I will talk about the particulars of the impact of addiction on families and how that really qualifies as trauma and look at it through the lens of trauma. And this is where I'll really ask for some examples of the ways that it has impacted you. If you're willing to share some of those things, I'd be really appreciate it. It kind of enrich the discussion. And then thirdly, I'd like to talk about post-traumatic growth, a concept that I think gives us a real hope and look into how do we change? What are the ways in which people do indeed overcome significant trauma and come through the other side, right? And so that's kind of a model that's kind of interesting and exciting to me to talk about. So I think we've got some slides there. Are we on the current slide? Cool. I'm going to try to keep up here. So understanding PTSD, we're going to start there. And while I present this, by the way, if this is somewhat new to you, or even if it isn't, I'd like for you to, if you've got your phone, you feel comfortable, you can jot it down. Identify the things in the symptoms of PTSD in particular that you know from your own personal life. This I experienced. Yes, this. So kind of be doing that, kind of a self-assessment, self-identification as we go through this. Basic definition, right? It's a condition that develops after a traumatic event, and it's caused by the traumatic events and the chronic stress of that, right? It can be either or both. The classic symptoms are kind of grouped into these four areas: reliving, avoidance, negative changes in thought and mood, and alterations in reactivity. Reliving is experienced by like the involuntary recall of distressing memories, having things come to mind, not when you're wanting them to, but just reflections of events that have occurred, that have happened in your life that are distressing. It can be distressing dreams. These can be classic nightmares or just troubling and recurring dreams, right? And then the distress that we can sometimes feel when we're exposed to cues that remind us of certain traumatic events, or that even symbolize or resemble a traumatic event. It doesn't have to be exact, right? And this kind of stress can be psychological and or physiological, right? We can have either symptoms. Some people have particularly physiological, symptoms. They have rapid heart rate and sweating and different things. Other people, it's all emotional or psychological, right? And the classic kind of stereotype of the let's say Vietnam vet who hears the helicopter sound and hits the deck in the grocery store parking lot, right? These are the kind of cues, right? But they can be more subtle than that. They can be just things that remind. There was a great example. I heard a story once about a veteran of Afghanistan who fought in Fallujah, and so did a lot of the urban warfare and fighting. And he couldn't tolerate going to the grocery store because when people stood in line behind him, that created way too much anxiety, because in the field of battle that he was in, to have somebody lined up behind him, from what I understand, that was death. You didn't want anyone behind you. And that was an example. It was enough of a cue, enough of a reminder that it brought forward those kind of distressing experiences. The other group is really pretty straightforward, avoidance. Avoidance of triggers or situations that remind us of traumatic events. In the case of the soldier that I just mentioned, he would go to the grocery store at 4 a.m. so as to avoid being there when there was anyone else in line behind him. Right? This is a little more involved part, the negative changes in thoughts and mood. These can involve things like dissociative amnesia, which just means not remembering full events or not remembering events at all, or just having partial memory of certain significant events. Negative beliefs about self, others, or the world, right? Distorted ideas about the causes of the events, blames themselves, blames others. Persistent negative emotional states, living in fear, anger, guilt, shame. I don't know about you guys, but that I can identify with all of those. Certainly, before I started my recovery, it would take me a bit of self-reflection to understand this, but I felt such an incredible sense of shame for things I hadn't done. But I don't know how to explain it, but I felt like a bond with it. It just seemed like it was my identity. It would take me a long time to come to understand that and unravel that. Feelings of detachment or estrangement from others, right? There's often this feeling of living a double life. You don't dare let people, like I didn't invite anybody over to my home. I didn't want people to know what was going on. And I would imagine if people really knew what had happened in my house last night, what would they think? And so this detachment or estrangement happens often, this alienation from feeling normal or like a normal member of society, right? And this inability to experience positive emotions, getting so used to feeling these negative emotional states from being sometimes hours, weeks, days, years in a traumatic experience of those negative, the fear, the horror, the shame, the guilt, those things, that once it maybe is even resolved or over, it can linger and a person can really find it hard to know what it is to feel peace of mind, to know what it is to feel safe, to know what it is to feel, these kinds of warm and other feelings that others take for granted. And finally, alterations in reactivity. This is like the irritable behaviors, the angry outbursts with little provocation that you'll sometimes see, a person who's really moody after a traumatic experience. Sometimes they can engage in reckless or self-destructive behavior, right? Risk-taking behaviors, other kinds of things. Certainly my own drinking and using was in this category. Hypervigilance. To this day, I just give an example, I can tell the sound of a glass that has alcohol in it versus one that doesn't. Because when I was a child, I would listen, and if I heard the chinkling sound of the ice in the glass, ice cubes separate and stay separated when there's alcohol in the glass. They don't when there's not. Now, how would I know that? That's hypervigilant. I could tell by the sound when you move the glass. And only a child that's really important to know that difference would know that. That's what hypervigilance is. This kind of being overly vigilant and aware of our environment. The classic, I sit with my back so that I can see the door in case I need to leave. This kind of thing. That's just real common in PTSD. Problems concentrating and sleep disturbance. So, identify with some of these things. These things people are familiar with. Because now what we're going to talk about is how these apply to the trauma of living with addiction. These are just some examples that I came up with of examples of family trauma from addiction. Let's say a child witnesses a parent's substance abuse, right? There's that. Or a spouse experiencing emotional abuse and neglect, or You could be a child who's observing that, these things can happen. A family member feeling responsible for the addict's behavior and the financial stress that's often due to the addict spending, and or if it's a child in the family, an adolescent, the enormous expense of trying to deal with that through counselors and treatment and other things, right? Anyone else want to join in and say, some things that you have examples of in your life that you would consider traumatic like this? Any other examples you could think of?
I actually have a question.
Yeah.
Do you believe in the methodology of sort of distinguishing or differentiating between little t trauma and big T trauma?
Yeah.
And how does that work with like the diagnosis?
Okay.
Thank you.
What I believe you're referring to is what we call big T traumas. When I first read the definition of trauma, I didn't think I had it. One of the earliest therapists I had said, David, you know what you have? You have PTSD. And I remember thinking to myself, I was never at war. I didn't go to Vietnam. I've never almost been killed. I was never even really physically abused as a part of what I experienced. So I can't have trauma. Because at the time, and still to this day, the definition is so oriented toward death or near death or dismemberment or witnessing something like that, right? In the strictest definition, that's what's called big T trauma. But as all of us know, that's not all of what's traumatic. And so what are considered little T traumas are things that don't quite measure up to that, although I will argue that for, let's say, children, and those of you who are familiar with the work of Bessel van der Kolk, he's really a promoter of this idea of what he calls developmental trauma. Because what's traumatic for a child is not necessarily traumatic for an adult, right? Take a child who's 3.5, 4 years old. Let's say we can have a perfectly safe physical environment for them with food, everything they need, but you leave them in there for 8 hours by themselves. Everybody goes, oh God, no, I would never do this. I said, why not? How's that trauma, right? Because what's trauma for a 3.5 or 4-year-old is not what's trauma for an adult. So I think we have to keep that in mind. That's the idea behind, and that little T traumas are things that are indeed traumatic, but maybe weren't about life or death per se. And I think they very much qualify. What we're talking about with an addict, although I will argue their life is at stake and our fear for that for them is certainly a factor. And we know addiction kills. There's probably people in here who have had that experience. People die from this disease. Yeah. Any examples of these, or I'll switch to we can go to the next slide. This is the impact, right? The emotional instability and unpredictability of the addict and the environment that's created. The fear of violence or aggression, or perhaps the loss of life of the addict because they engage in such risky behaviors, drinking and driving and other risky behaviors, right? The financial distress and uncertainty, the social isolation that I spoke of, the living a double life, the feeling of secret, and certainly going along with that, the shame, guilt, and helplessness. Anybody identify with those experiences? Yeah. This was what it's about, right? And this, to me, is why the model of trauma works for thinking about these kinds of things, even though it doesn't fit the strictest definition of what trauma is. I will argue that it absolutely is traumatic. And anybody who's been through it knows this. They feel it in their body. They've been through it. It's a particularly strange and unusual experience that's very hard to describe to somebody else if they haven't been through it. They don't understand the degree to which the illness takes over the person who has it and affects the family members. If you love somebody, it has a dramatic effect, right? So through acceptance and healing, it's essential to recognize that these experiences can have a profound effect on our mental health and emotional well-being and that of our family. It's by acknowledging the traumatic nature of these experiences that we can begin to understand the need for support, self-care, and healing, right? That's why I'm glad you're here. That's why I'm glad we're talking about it. That's why I'm glad to tell you about my own personal experience. I don't have any qualms with doing that because I feel like it helps people. When we can talk about these things, the fact that I can sit up here and talk about it with you is a measure of how far I've come so far with this thing. Now I want to talk to you about post-traumatic growth. Anybody heard of this before? Yeah, it's a cool concept, right? And it's this idea that positive changes occur in the aftermath of trauma, right? And we're talking about, though, more than just ordinary resilience, which is more just this adapting well to adversity, the normal kinds of things, the difficulties. It may be really difficult, it may be really challenging, but post-traumatic growth occurs when resiliency fails, okay? If resiliency is the ability to bounce back, then growth is what happens. This post-traumatic growth is what happens when it fails. And that's, when it fails, is so over here on the right-hand side, it's the impact events is well beyond our capacity to cope. And a person is literally shook to the core. And the basic core beliefs about who I am, what it means to be in the world, what a family is, what my future is, all of those things are sometimes taken away, crushed, dashed. I mean, it's a disruption in those basic beliefs and understandings, the things that make us understand who we are in the world. They get disrupted. And that kind of thing is something that no one wants to go through, but it is the very thing that we believe then can eventually lead a person to a sense of personal growth, which is the good news, right? The examples of what it looks like, right, are increased self-awareness and self-compassion, improved relationships and communication skills, greater appreciation for life and a sense of purpose, increased resilience and coping skills, and a greater sense of meaning and spirituality. And I'll go on to say, it isn't automatic, and it certainly doesn't happen overnight. It happens over, in my own case, decades is what it's taken. And it takes courage, it takes persistence, and it takes a lot of commitment in the face of enormous pain. But if you are willing and open, and the potential for relief, then the potential for relief, change, and life-affirming growth is, I believe, within each one of us, within you. And now, as kind of a cap on this, I have a poem that I just love. And I don't know, I'm going to try to make the audio play because there's a poet that I like who reads this poem and kind of comments on it. And I want you to hear that. It's called Pushing Through. Are any of you familiar with this poem? It's by Rilke poem. And I'm just going to see if I can play this now and get the audio to.
It is possible I am pushing through solid rock as the ore lies alone. I am such a long way in, I can see no way through and no space. Everything is close to my face, and everything close to my face is stone. I don't have much knowledge yet in grief, so this darkness makes me feel small. You be the master, make yourself fierce, break in, and then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. Poem of tremendous courage here. I mean, here, his immobility is so much that he goes right to the heart of the stone. He becomes the stone itself. And then he cries out to the universe, to God, whatever your language is, for the sacred otherness of life, to break in And he says, and then your great transforming will happen to me and my great grief cry will happen to you. It's a poem of tremendous courage because he realizes that at that moment in your life, the only thing you have to give is your grief cry, is that sound. It's your only gift back to the universe. And perhaps the world, the universe, God is trying to hear what that particular suffering sounds like. We don't know. There's no other rationale for it. Why should human beings go through such tremendous suffering? Why should children who do nothing to anyone in Sarajevo right now be having their limbs blown off, by random mortar shells? Why should that happen? There's nothing you can say, except you can't cut yourself off from it. You can only, feel the terrible pain of that, and you open to it, and you open to whatever is there. And you be the master, make yourself fierce, break in, and then your great transforming will happen to me, and my great grief cry will happen to you. It's like this incredibly intimate lovemaking where the only thing Rilke has to give is his grief. And he gives it. He says, here, this is mine.
That's a poet named David White from a collection of poems, a talk that he gave, a collection of poems that are called Poetry of Self-Compassion. I encourage you to look it up. It's just been a very meaningful, sometimes the poets can just say it like nobody else. It's a great way to express what it's like to experience the trauma, and then that break, as he said, that transforming that can happen from that place. Oh, I'm sorry. I forgot. And, yeah. I'm getting there myself, honestly. Let's see. So, addiction and trauma are closely linked. That's I think that's true. And it's essential to recognize the traumatic impact of addictions on families. And by understanding PTSD and its application to family experiences and exploring the concept of post-traumatic growth, we can begin to heal and recover. And always want to leave on a little bit of hope. You're not alone. There is support available. You guys know that better than most. This is what you're here for. And whether it's through therapy, support groups, here, online resources, there are people and organizations that do care about you and want to help. Been the recipient of great help, and for that I'm really grateful, and I'm really grateful to be here tonight and for the chance to present to you. Thank you.
We're going to open up the time for questions and answers, and as a reminder, to have an expert here in the field it's a great opportunity for us to just ask those questions that we've been thinking about. And I'll open up with a couple of questions, but really encourage that the microphone's going to be floating around. So if you do have a question, raise your hand, and we'll make sure that microphone makes it. And for those online, feel free to submit. We're also tracking, and we'll be reading those questions as well. Thank you so much, Dr. Clemons, for the presentation. Sure. And not just the presentation itself, but also the vulnerability and sharing about how you connect on many different levels. You started off this talk by saying, a thank you to everyone here for the courage to take these first steps to be in the room. And then later you talked about, you referenced it again, courage, but you also said that 3 key elements was courage, persistence, and commitment. And so for family members that are here that hear the talk about post-traumatic stress disorder, but maybe don't have a community around them that say, that hypervigilance, that your inability to be able to sleep at night because you're thinking about your family member, no one really makes that connection that this is trauma that they're experiencing. So right. How's that been, that experience for you as you're working with families and identifying that as actual trauma?
Well, I think it's one of the most important things that we begin with is helping them understand that what they're going through is normal for the abnormal situation that they're in, right? That there's a name for it, that I can show them a list of that's what I love about these lists of symptoms, to say, yeah, so that's not you. That's like when you go to the doctor, let's say you didn't know anything about the flu, right? And your doctor goes, we're going to have these body aches, you're going to have these fevers, you're going to have these chills, you're going to have this. You're like, you're magic. How do you know this? And it's, well, because I know the flu. that's what that is. That's not who you are. This is what we call it. And so, right, people imagine that it's unique to them, that there must be something wrong with them. They're weak. Maybe other people would go through it more, eloquently or gracefully. All these things, all these misunderstandings, and have often been long suffering in silence by the time they reach therapy or a professional like myself. So that's one of the earliest things we do, is really try to break free from the stigma and begin to understand, what this is and how to begin to recover from it.
And as family members begin to understand this, oftentimes you hear about adults who, these behaviors, they don't attribute it to addiction or cycles. They just think this person's grumpy or upset, or they don't really care about our needs. And so how often is that misinterpreted? Like they miss the mark of saying this is addiction, but
every now and then, that's maybe what I'll see, is that there's kind of a misperception of what's happening in the family, and I start inquiring further, and it starts sounding to me like it might be. So there can be an educational process with some people that maybe are in that stage where they're not sure what's going on and they need help or guidance understanding what addiction is. But by and far, I would say most people have been long suffering with this by the time they reach out for help, and they know exactly what it is. They know that they've been dealing with addiction. They may not understand that well, but they know that that what they've been experiencing is absolutely the result of this person's drinking and using behavior. Yeah.
And Dr. Clemons, and I'll ask this last question as we open up, and again, raise your hand if you have questions. But what resources would you share with family members or caregivers who are saying, I'm hearing this, I'm beginning to recognize that what I'm experiencing is trauma, but where do I go next? Who do I go to? What resources would you offer?
Well, so you're talking about somebody who I might be seeing individually. Yeah. I send them to, community support groups, the different 12-step groups, that exist for family members. There's, Codependence Anonymous, Al-Anon. There's specific Al-Anon for people dealing with a child who has alcoholism. Those are the primary ones. But as I was talking earlier with Russ, there's a shortage of resources for people outside of that, for people maybe that hasn't been a really good fit with, that kind of thing. So, yeah.
Well, certainly for this program, key elements that we look at is building a community, which is what you're a part of here. For those joining here, we want to be able to have a space, kind of what you're talking about, where people can connect with each other.
Yeah.
The education piece is really what we're doing here, and then the support, those next steps where people can kind of get the help that they need. I have lots of questions to ask because I'm that person that is like, I want to ask all these questions, but I don't want to take over all the space. So if there is a question, we can make that microphone run there. So.
If y'all don't want to speak into the mic, then you're also welcome to look at the QR code on the handouts that you have by your seat, and I'm happy to ask for you. But we do have a question about, can you talk a little bit how what Dr. David Clemons talked about relates to ITC that has been mentioned before, the invitation to change. How does this connect in some of that community education and support that you were talking about?
Is that to me?
Both of you.
So invitation to change model is something that we're building into the CARES program. It's a model of support and engagement. It's evidence-based, but the idea is that we're helping bring awareness. And really, honestly, everything that Dr. Clemons talked about in terms of education and understanding is what this model's about. So much stigma that's out there can be overcome when people understand it's not because you failed as a parent. It's not because you missed something or you should have done better. The addiction pattern, the way it functions on the brain, those are the kind of pieces that people need to understand. This isn't, I failed as a parent. This is a substance that's impacting the body. And so invitation to change is a way of being able to structure a lot of these lessons to bring awareness and to bring support build a community, and then provide them a space to be able to be empowered to do action and change a lot of the patterns that are happening at home. So these are things that we're building into the program coming up. And Dr. Clemons, this is actually a good question to kind of lead off from that. When people are processing in groups like this, trauma comes up. And a big buzzword that comes up a lot is EMDR.
Sure.
Could you tell us a little bit about what that is and how that works in the space of addiction and recovery?
Sure. EMDR is a tool for treating trauma, for trauma resolution. It stands for eye movement desensitization and reprocessing. If somebody's familiar with that, it's a mouthful. Only psychologists would come up with such a thing. And but what it does is essentially it gives practitioners, psychologists, therapists a tool to help effectively and efficiently resolve traumatic experiences. Just thinking of non-identifying case examples, but let's say there was a person whose spouse collapsed at home one time and was in a, they were in a pool and, they had to resuscitate them, right? They went through all that, they did that, they called EMS, the kids were there, all of these things happened. And then they would later, come in, and this would be a thing that we might be talking about. And when they talked about it, you would just notice their affective state would start to change. They would start to get choked up. They would get emotional. They get tearful. And so we would use that EMDR model to process that particular memory of that particular experience. It's a detailed way of doing that allows people to go into the experience in a safe way and reprocess it in a way that then there is this kind of shift in perspective and, thinking of, let's say, an example, not in recovery, but of somebody that's experienced a sexual assault. The common belief of a person who's gone through that, no matter how much they may know differently intellectually, they will say, I feel like it was my fault. And so one of the things like an EMDR experience what will happen during that experience is they will suddenly say, as part of the session, this had nothing to do with me. They'll arrive at that conclusion at the end of the processing. So that's the kind of shifts in perspective. So in the case of recovery, it's this sense of really understanding, not just knowing intellectually, I didn't cause that person's addiction. It had nothing to do with me. It's like the real getting in the body of, oh, that really didn't have anything to do with me, the felt sense of it. And so it can have real value in treating traumas of different kinds. Yeah.
And when you talk about traumas, these experiences, and you went through a list, you talked about hypervigilance, you talked about dreams and people having difficulty with sleep, that sometimes people might think, this is just because I'm stressed.
Right.
And they don't recognize that as the, small T trauma, big T trauma.
Yeah.
So for family members that are going through this kind of stress, or caregivers are going through stress, and if I may use the example, they hear of a psychologist. Sometimes you have families that feel this fear of talking to a professional or reaching out.
Oh, sure.
Do you feel that still exists in this recovery circle space, a fear of talking to professionals? And how do you overcome that as a professional yourself when you explain everything that you're sharing?
It still exists. I mean, it's much better than it's ever been, I think, but it still exists. And I think the main thing is just to be empathetic. I might, at an appropriate level, self-identify. If I see somebody looking really nervous or anxious, I'll just let them know, I've gone through this myself. I know what this is. And other ways to make people, feel like, they're not going to be the object of study. They're not this, person that I just try to break it down, try to be authentic and real with people. That's like build that connection so that they feel safe, because that's really the key, is that they feel safe, they feel understood, and they feel like, you can help them. I think those are the key things to bridging that, initial maybe fear about reaching out or talking to someone.
And one follow-up question to that, Dr. Clemons, what would you say to maybe the child who is witnessing this and is happening with their parent and trying to build that safety, but there's this complexity about this as my parent, and here we are again in this, the roles get really tricky, and sometimes that's complicated. So how do you advise someone that might be in the crowd saying, I need to go home and talk to my parent, and when those symptoms come up, how do I stay, focused in the moment where I feel like I'm being dragged into my trauma as well?
So let me see if I'm understanding. You're talking about somebody who might be a minor child?
Let's say an adult.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Who
is working with a parent who is needing recovery services.
I see.
And they are now engaged in this moment of, I'm feeling traumatized right now. I want to shut down. All the symptoms that were there.
Yeah.
How do they manage that moment with their parent when they may have relapsed in?
Right. Well, it's difficult, right? I mean, we've got to learn different kinds of self-care, and sometimes, quite frankly, it's to learn how to leave those moments, how to take care of oneself. If another person's been drinking and you're getting triggered by that, sometimes the best thing to do is just to allow yourself permission to not have to sit and deal with that, honestly. And, to learn how to take care of yourself, because a lot of times what people will do is they'll stick around and they'll stay with this person, and then they'll feel like they have to stay with them and ride through this entire experience with them. And so learning basic sense of boundaries that, no, you don't. You can talk to them the next day, and you can call some people for support. You can reach out to some others. You can, so really learning how to take care of the self first, because that's one of the most difficult, challenging things to do when you have a family member, and to break those cycles of, a lot of times you can do that by asking them questions like, well, what typically would you do, and what have you done? And then the question, how's that gone? How's that working? Not very well. They haven't changed. Nothing's happened. So it helps them to realize, it pulls at my heartstrings, and that makes me want to stick around, stay engaged, and do things that I really, I feel like I owe it to them or I need to do. But when they realize it's not actually helping, it's not actually changing anything, so it's okay not to do those things. And it would be better to take care of oneself and regroup, and then talk about, what do you want to do about alcoholism once you understand that, not just about drinking, which is just the symptom, right? Yeah.
So permission to disengage, permission to take care of yourself,
yeah.
permission to walk away from this and then come back at a later time if needed.
Yeah, absolutely. And to develop more understanding of what they're dealing with and what's the better approach, right, to the illness as a whole, as opposed to just the symptom of it, right? Yeah.
We got a microphone running around. We got another question.
Yeah, so Dr. Clemons, hearing your own story, I guess, with your parents and yourself and now your son, and I think a lot of people wonder about, this transference of, maybe it's the trauma, maybe it's alcoholism or addiction throughout families. And I guess for people that, are either have had experience themselves or are worried about a family member, a child, a spouse, or a parent, is there anything you would give people to take away that would just be, how do you use what your knowledge, and how do you talk to the family and try to slow this thing down? Because it seems like the spread is just crazy among families.
Yeah, it is. And we don't exactly understand what all the factors are to that, right? We know that there's a heavy genetic component to it, and there's certainly environmental aspects to it. But I'll just use my own family's example. I think you slow it down by entering into various forms of recovery, getting well yourself, right? The way I look at the progression, when I see the level of the disease and the generation that were my parents versus me, I got it at 24 with relatively little damage done, relative to what they went through. They both literally almost died. I did not. I didn't come close to that. In fact, When I give talks on the disease, one of the things I've began to teach in recent years is this idea of understanding addiction like you would cancer in terms of stages. And I think there's, stage 4 or 5 cancer looks vastly different than stage 1. But stage 1 is still cancer. I feel fine, doc. I say, yeah, but you got cancer, right? And if you have it, you want to know it. And so I consider myself fortunate in that, in a way, my own recovery, because I started my recovery first, dealing with the family dynamics and aspects of it, that led to my identification of my own addictive pattern, which I had then been free from for 6 months by the time I identified with that. So there's the kind of progress, right? I could stop at 24 before my entire life became consumed by it. And I'd be able to stick with it. And my own son, right, he went through about a year of addiction before, we intervened before it got better. Now, I went through all these things that we're just talking about, the guilt, the shame. There's a thing that they teach in Al-Anon on that some of you may have heard. They say, I didn't cause it, can't cure it, and I can't control it, right? But I had one that I had held in reserve, and that was I thought I could prevent it. All I had done, all my recovery, I thought I could prevent it. I found out I didn't. I couldn't. And once I got over that, I became grateful for the fact that his mom and I and his sister were able to respond the way we did to it early on when it showed up. Early on, we caught it, and we intervened, and he got treatment, and he's been well now for, he's coming up on 6 years. So that's the kind of progress, I think. That's how it stopped spreading. It's, like that, perhaps. That's my model, is that we get well ourselves, and we pass that down as much as we pass down the genetics or the disease for it, whatever we... One time a person told me that there's a Native American spiritual belief. He told me this. I've never affirmed this myself, but he said, whatever you heal in this lifetime, he says, goes 7 generations forward and 7 generations back. That's what he told me. I kind of like that idea. So I think we put the focus on our own wellness. We do that for our own reasons, but then I think we can also think that we are... And my son will tell you, he'll say, yeah, it way helped me, the fact that how y'all were and how you were growing up and all of that had a real impact on his ability to get recovery and stay in recovery. Because we were, quote, speaking the language since he was a kid. Yeah.
What you share here is a message of hope. And that is, I think, a big reason of why people show up tonight. Of what can we do? There's so much out there. There's so much of our own lives that we can share that is really difficult. But the idea of what's next and the hope that you can instill. What advice would you give to communities like this, schools, churches, groups, that may have people that say, we don't have experience with addiction, but we're seeing it pop up in our communities? What can we do as a larger group to help those?
Well, I think what y'all are doing, which is education, is essential. What this disease doesn't like is people getting together and talking about it. You know what I mean? I've seen that kind of organic intervention happen in family systems more times than not. The spouse will come in first, and then we get some other members, and then you encourage them to start talking about it. They develop a language to talk about it that isn't pejorative, but they're no longer keeping it a secret. They're no longer hiding. They're coming out of the shadows, so to speak. And then all of a sudden, the alcoholic shows up and is ready, because as we begin to talk about these things, as we begin to shine the light at them, as we begin to identify, as we lose our shame, right? Then what happens is there's this message of hope starts to come through. This community becomes possible. We can share with each other like few other people. Few other people understand what it's like, but those of us who do, when you sit in a room together with other people, there's something special that happens because you get it, and you can talk about it, and you don't have to explain it. These people understand it. And So I would say, forms of community involvement, forms of education, breaking the stigma by, people, just the statistics alone. We know that it's in our congregations. We know that it's in our agencies. We know that it's in our places of work, that it happens. And so I think we're evolving. I think we're changing. And the more that happens, I think the more we begin to break the cycles, because the disease loves secrecy and shame. It thrives on that. And unfortunately, that's one of the impulsive reaction to it when it's occurring, right? I certainly went there and stayed there for years when I was a child, and I had no idea, and breaking that cycle through these ways is, I think, really important.
We have one more question here in the crowd.
Hello, doctor. So how do we start those conversations as a family unit of healing when not necessarily everybody believes in therapy, let's say?
Yeah. So the family members, you break the ice somehow. You begin to start broaching the topic with maybe the safest person, the person you feel close with. They say, hey, I have this thing on my mind. I want to talk about it. Can we talk about Dad's drinking, or can we talk about, this thing that happened? It's hard to do, but break the ice with somebody and see how it goes, and see if there isn't kind of reciprocity there, that they begin to feel relieved about talking about it, and certainly educating yourself about what is addiction, what does it mean, and how can we recover, right? And let it spread in the family to people who you think would benefit, right? To start to talk to each other about it and what we've been through, and maybe bring home some literature or some books, or invite them to things like this. Whatever kind of works to get people to start their own version of whatever recovery is from it, to begin to understand it and to begin to take actions that get out from underneath the rock, Yeah.
Dr. Clemons, we have another question here.
We can possibly close with these. It's a two-part. So let's say I am a family member of a loved one who is facing addiction, right?
Yeah.
They don't want to go to therapy.
Right.
So why should I? I don't have addiction.
Right.
What benefits do I get out of going to therapy if the person who's facing the addiction isn't willing to go themselves?
Right.
And then the second part of that question, I know, but maybe you can help explain a little bit, that therapy is not created equal, right? There are different types of therapy paths, of therapists, of kind of therapeutic services you can get. So if I am someone looking for therapy, what are the things I should be looking at? And to be more specific, if you could expand a little bit more of, what are solution-focused therapies versus your usual CBT? What does somatic therapy do for people who have, addiction, or those supporting them? And what does this look like with EMDR that you even mentioned earlier? So
Okay.
those two-part questions.
So remind me the first part again is, why should I be in therapy?
Yes.
I don't have the problem, kind of thing. And, I would just empathize, say, I can completely understand with that. Yes, you are not causing most of this, but it impacts you, does it not? Right? And the way therapy can help is, it can really begin to help to understand what's going on, to also be able to, as I mentioned earlier, find some new ways to develop some boundaries and ways to take care of oneself, to get the support needed to understand addiction, and also understand the need for their own well-being, and that's what therapy can be about. Not that you've done anything wrong, or there's anything wrong with you, or that there's something you've failed to do, and that's why you're in therapy, but to cast it in a positive light, that this is a good thing that you can benefit from, right? Yeah. And your second question is about the types of therapies, right? And what should people be looking for when they're looking for a therapy? The reason why there's a bunch of different types is because they all work. They do. I mean, what we do when we do these meta-analyses about therapy is that they work, and none of them seem to work any particularly better than another. I will say that Certainly for trauma, some of these, what we call experiential methods, which EMDR is one of. Experiential means that you're not just talking about things, but that you're also moving into deep emotional experiences in the therapy room that can access the aspects of healing and recovery that don't have anything to do with words, if that makes sense. There's aspects of it that just purely, in other words, we all come by trauma through direct experiences we have, right? And so one of the primary ways we're going to recover from it is through the direct experiences we have. And one of those experiences is EMDR. There's other experiential therapies. So for trauma, I would say look for that if they're identifying with that particular thing. It's really important that they seek professionals who have a background and are well versed in addiction, and not everybody is. So that would be something that I would want to ask. What are your qualifications? What are your experiences in working with addiction per se, and working with family members who've had it? Really just ask that. This should be something readily that they can talk about very easily, and that they can give you good examples of. So that's the other thing that I would talk about. And then the models beyond that, whether it's CBT, whether it's family systems therapy, whether it's one of the others, is people are trained in a certain way. People gravitate toward a certain model. What's most essential to the model is that A, it makes sense to you, and B, that your practitioner really believes in that, believes in what they're doing. Because I think that's what we find is that we, as therapists, we're attracted to models that fit, that make sense for us, that we can believe in. And if I really believe in it, then I'm going to do that well. And they all kind of work because they all have a lot in common, quite honestly. They have more in common than they have, different from one another. Yeah.
We actually have 2 more questions, so yeah, we have time.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your presentation tonight. The question I have is, so you started out, we talked about PTSD, and it is, the correlation, the challenge I think most of us will run into is it would be hard to sit in a room with individuals that you've described who have been to the Middle East and experienced those kinds of events versus one of the post-traumatic that you experienced through either alcoholism yourself or association with alcoholism or dependency.
Yeah.
So you ended the conversation. We've kind of gone back to what I would call more traditional therapy towards alcoholism and those kinds of things. Is there is it a separation between the PTSD thinking and the historical approach to, I guess, how pervasive is PTSD correlation to what happens in alcoholism, association with alcoholism and those things to therapy? So is your thinking unique?
Say that in another way. I'm just trying to understand what you mean. Like, so does trauma influence alcoholism in the people who have it, or no?
No, I'm sorry, I'm not clear in my question, but
Yeah.
I guess so. It is. We talked about how do we find help,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
You gave great examples of the interview cycles and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
If somebody were to go and want to talk to somebody who believed, right? So the PTSD correlation is new to me.
Okay.
And I'm not going to speak for anybody else in the room, but maybe new to others as well.
Okay.
And it's interesting, and if I extrapolate that it's a correlation to PTSD, and I'm looking for somebody or somebody's looking for help in that nature.
Yes.
Is the conversation with a therapist going to be, if that subject gets broached, I'm using myself just to make it easy, right?
Yep.
I'm asking for a friend. And so if I came to you and sat down, I would know just by this conversation tonight that you've made that connection.
I see what you're saying.
Is it pervasive throughout the therapy profession that this is a correlation?
It's getting that way, but it's not, I don't know that it's pervasive. So that's why it would be important to get somebody who understands addiction and understands trauma. I think there's growing evidence that our definition of trauma is woefully inadequate, that it doesn't include a lot of things that are traumatic, okay? But there's a lot that goes into that, including money and politics and all kinds of things, right? So people that understand addiction will understand how that model fits with that, but they should also be able to treat it, you see? And that's why I was saying these people that are informed and know about experiential methods of treating trauma, but not everyone will put those two things together. No, it's not a pervasive correlation. In fact, that's why I emphasize it here tonight, because it's not exactly all the way there. In a way, what I'm saying isn't that new, but to some people it would be.
Sure.
Yeah.
Thank you again.
Yeah, of course. Thank you.
And we have another question up front.
Sorry. I was sort of just going to add to everything you were saying, and when I heard what you said, Joan, complex PTSD is what really drew me and what made me understand what I had. PTSD definitely, but I couldn't understand it because my dad was in Vietnam and I didn't have that, what I thought.
Yeah.
And then I realized, oh yeah, I do. It was just shoved down, and then I got sober and it started to bubble up. But complex PTSD really spoke to me because that's just little T traumas over and over and over and over and over again.
Yeah.
Severe neglect, whatever. Yeah.
So what she's mentioning in terms of what we call complex PTSD is when I mentioned the childhood example, what's traumatic for a child isn't necessarily the same thing as the way we'd measure it with an adult. And what we call process trauma is different than event-based trauma, right? Event-based trauma is a car accident, an assault, things like that. Process is the day in and day out recurring things that happen that might be small, any given one of them, but you add them up over time and they accumulate. And or, when I first started to identify my own, I would try to describe it. I'd say, it's almost like I have absence trauma. And people would say, well, what does that mean? And I go, it's the things that didn't happen because it was primarily neglect. Neglect is really hard to wrap your mind around, but it is if you look that up in terms of abuse, you'll see neglect is one of the defining abuses. One of the characters, part of the definition of abuse is neglect.
And especially when you don't know what you don't know.
How would you know?
Right.
You don't know. All you know is what's happening, and it's really hard to put your finger on something that didn't happen, as opposed to when events are happening that are clearly out of line. It's when mom or dad doesn't come home for hours, and you get used to that because this happens on occasion. You're all alone, and you're trying that kind of thing, right? But that accumulates, and it has an impact on a child because the child starts to wonder, what's that about? Is it about me? Why aren't they coming home? Are they going to come home? Are they going to come home tonight? What do I do if they don't? All of these things that a child goes through. Yeah.
I could talk to you all night. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
We do have one more to wrap up after these two questions, actually. So again, just to give an example, I am someone who recently found out I have PTSD. But now that I know that, I've been sent to a gut doctor because of all of the digestive problems I've been facing for years. And on top of that, more health problems start to arise, and some of that includes having to investigate, do I have CPTSD and not just PTSD? Can you talk a little bit about those comorbidities that might come out once you're diagnosed and the journey of...
You mean the physical comorbidities?
Yes.
Yeah. So a lot of us express these traumatic experiences in our bodies. Not everybody, but some people do, and we don't exactly understand all of how that works, right? But we know there's a mind-body connection, and we know that Bessel van der Kolk, the researcher that I was mentioning earlier, he wrote a profound book. I really recommend it if you haven't read it. and it's titled "The Body Keeps the Score," and that title tells you, right, is that the body is, we understand, is holding a lot of, certainly that can just be holding a lot of the emotion, but some people, then that has manifestations in terms of physical venom, especially the gut kind, the kind that you're describing and all of that. So yeah, there's a high correlation there. The cool thing is that as you begin to start to identify with how that makes sense in you, the emotions that are associated with different, physical manifestations, and you start to get more of a clarity, more of a consciousness around what those emotions are, and then there's the chance to start dealing with them more indirectly, and they don't have to come out on the body, and that's the big hope there, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
People do get
you.
well. Yeah.
Well, for tonight, I want to say, Dr. Clemons, you've really given us a challenge, because one of the things that we heard you say is the guilt and shame that keeps us isolated and quiet. And as you shared right now, that manifests itself in physical symptoms, relational issues, patterns that go on for generations. And you've given us also a challenge for our communities to give spaces where we can talk about this and open that up. And so I want to thank you for sharing your knowledge, your expertise. We hope that we can keep you as a resource.
Of course.
That if people have further questions, that they can reach out to you. If they're seeking services, they can connect, and we'll definitely be sharing that. And as part of what we're working on here, just a reminder that this is part of what we're doing every Monday to build a community where we can share information. So to that extent of trying to take away from that guilt and shame and being isolated, encouraging everyone, please do share this with someone. So if you know someone that could benefit from this, bring them over. We've got cards that are going to be moving around here with QR codes, information that you can share with other people, because what we want to do is we want to make sure that if you had a benefit, or if you felt like something spoke to you tonight, that it could speak to someone you know, and it might help change the direction of their life as well. And online, feel free to share. The video will be posted fairly soon, and we're also going to be posting on social media. So please, as much as possible, spread the word. Our program is here. It's continuing. It's growing, and we want to have a continued presence and impact on the community. So with that, Dr. Clemons, thank you again for joining us. And as we say here, if it's your first time here, welcome home.